Welcome, everyone. I'm Kara Stein. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Program at the American Constitution Society. And thank you for joining us and for joining this conversation on the road to clinical teaching. This year, ACS is celebrating our 20th anniversary of shaping legal debate and nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force for improving the lives of all people. And as many of you know, over the years, we've done numerous programs on various aspects of practicing law. One area we haven't done as much on is how to enter legal academia. And so we've started to try to correct that. This is the second in our series on the path to legal academia. If you're an ACS member who knows that you've always wanted to enter law teaching, or is just starting to think that you might want to do that, I hope you'll be in touch with us if you're an ACS member and ask us how we can help you, or tell us about what kind of programming and information you think would be of use. And if you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. And you can find us online at acslaw.org, where you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Joel Dodge, who is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School and judicial strategy attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And no less important to us whatsoever, he is a co-chair of the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. Joel, please take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Kara. And it's great to be here with everybody today for this exciting discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by a really exceptional group of panelists today. We have with us Alexi Freeman, who is Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Director of Social Justice Initiatives, and Professor of the Practice of Law and ACS Faculty Advisor at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. We also have Erica Hashimoto, who is Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning at Georgetown University Law Center. And we have with us, last but not least, Sarah Shelf, who is Professor of Law and Director of Clinical Programs at the University of Virginia School of Law. And she's the steering committee chair for ACS's Virginia Lawyer Chapter. Just at the top, I wanted to say we will save some time at the end for questions, so please submit them at any time during the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes or so at the end of the program. Okay, so to get things started, I thought it would make sense just to begin by talking about how we each wound up in clinical law. And just for myself, despite the name of the panel, I'm actually not really a clinical teacher. I teach legal practice and writing at Columbia Law School, which is a little bit different. And we might be able to get into this later, but adjunct teaching like legal writing to 1Ls, which is what I do, can be a really good way to get a foothold within academia, maybe an opportunity that's available earlier in an attorney's career, as opposed to a clinical role supervising students in practice, which might require more experience. But let's hear more about that. So I'm eager to learn how you each became clinical law professors and what led you to it, whether there was a moment along the way when you doubted the course, or what changed your mind and how you wound up where you are today. So Sarah, I'd love to start with you.
Okay. Well, I did not come out of law school thinking that I wanted to be a professor, even much less a clinical professor. I actually, once upon a time, wanted to be a math professor. And it was actually the change in that course that led me to going to law school. So I really came to law school wanting to practice law. And I went through law school. I got a job at a litigation boutique in Atlanta. I clerked and then worked for this litigation boutique for, it was 6 or 7 years, at the point at which I had to think about whether I really wanted to push for partnership. And as they say, partnership is a pie eating contest where the prize is more pie. And I had to decide whether I wanted more pie, and I concluded that I didn't want more pie. I loved my firm, but I couldn't see myself doing that for the rest of my life. And so I started thinking about what else I might do with my law degree. And that's where I sort of circled back to that idea of being a teacher, being a professor. But what I had in mind, what I sort of the paradigm of being a law professor was to be a doctrinal professor. And so I tried going down that road. I went part-time at my firm with their support because, they helped me work out a deal where I could work part-time, and I was working on scholarship. And the other problem was that I was limited in geographically. So I was married, my husband's practice, I was married to a lawyer. My husband's practice was centered in Georgia. And so I didn't really have the option to go anywhere, outside of Georgia. We weren't going to uproot the family, for a law position somewhere else. So I was really looking at the Georgia law schools and maybe Samford in Birmingham. And those schools just didn't have, they had like positions in tax and bankruptcy, which I couldn't, I couldn't fake. And so I kept, plugging away on the scholarship, and that was difficult to do, working part-time. And I was on the verge of actually just quitting my law firm job and really working on scholarship full-time when a position came available at Emory to be the director of the externship program. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized, so at this point I had 8 or 9 years of practice, and the more I realized that this was actually a better opportunity for me. On the one hand, I could do scholarship if I wanted to. At Emory, I was able to do workshops, and I could hire RAs, and if I wanted to pursue scholarship, I could. But at the same time, I had started to feel like all these years of practice and all the professional network that I had built up in Atlanta was going to go to waste if I took a doctrinal position, because it didn't seem like that was valued. Whereas in the externship program, it was very much valued. So I applied for that position, and the more, I thought about it, the more I actually, you asked whether or not there was a point at which I doubted the course. The more I did it, the more I was like, what, no, this is really the course for me. And so, like I said, I didn't regret it. And the more I did it, the more I felt like this is like the best of all possible worlds, because I have the flexibility I did actually end up teaching civil procedure. I've been working on scholarship, haven't managed to publish yet, but still working on it. And also get to work with students and help them transition from the classroom into the practice of law. And then I got this position at UVA. This is my alma mater. So I felt very lucky to have this position come available as director of clinical programs, and get to move back to my alma mater and continue to work and actually have an impact in my community of Charlottesville, where I went to undergrad and law school. And so it's actually important to me to be able to have an impact in my community. So that is my path in a nutshell. And I'll pass it on to Erica.
Thanks, Sarah. So like Sarah, I didn't have a particularly linear path into clinical education. So I was at the Federal Public Defender's Office in DC, practicing and representing clients charged with criminal offenses. I loved being a lawyer. I loved trying cases. I loved doing appeals, and it broke my heart. It stressed me out so much to have my clients' lives in my hands. And so after I practiced there, I was kind of trying to think about what to do next. And I couldn't imagine myself at a law firm. And I wasn't exactly sure what I might do. And a friend of mine suggested that I go on the teaching market on the doctrinal side. And so somewhat, this was during a period of time when you didn't have to be as well credentialed, with scholarly articles on the doctrinal market. And I got hired by the University of Georgia to teach criminal law to first years, evidence and sentencing and criminal procedure. And I did that for 4 years, large classes, and I loved my students. What I loved watching was watching their minds open up and learn to be lawyers and learn to be advocates. What I missed more than I had ever thought I would was having clients. And I felt like I couldn't spend the rest of my career in a classroom without representing clients. And so I told my dean that I wasn't sure I wanted to go up for tenure, that I thought it made more sense for me to, go back out and practice law. And so she offered me the opportunity to start a clinic at Georgia. I had taken the appellate litigation clinic when I was at Georgetown, and I called my former professor and said, okay, I think I might be trying to start a clinic. What do I do? And he was wonderful and helped me get it up and running. And we started getting court appointments in the 11th Circuit and the DC Circuit. And my students and I would represent clients. And I was still teaching 2 large classes, so my clinic was pretty small. And then when my former professor decided to step down from teaching the clinic at Georgetown, which was my alma mater, I moved to Georgetown and teach clinics full-time now. I think it's the best of all possible worlds. My students and I care deeply about the cases we work on. We care deeply about our clients. And I also have a teaching role. So, that to me is so much fun. And so what I would say about clinical education more than anything else is it is stressful because, having students work on and litigate cases can be stressful. At the same time, it is the most rewarding job in so many ways. And I will turn it over to Alexi with that.
Thank you all so much, and it's such a privilege to be on the panel with both Professor Sheff and Hashimoto. Thank you to ACS for running the event. I never had such an event when I was a law student, or didn't know such events existed, and I can imagine the amount of help they would have provided me. It's kind of shocking to me sometimes that I am a law professor and an associate dean because of 2 main reasons. One, I never thought I would be a lawyer, period. I knew I wanted to do racial justice work, and that was sort of what I wanted to do since I was a child growing up in an interracial household, but I didn't think law was the tool for that. An internship program as a college student showed me that I could use this degree, but it was just not the pathway I'd been thinking. And then 2, I associate law professors with law students who are on law review, who do judicial clerkships, who raise their hand the most in class, and all of those things. I didn't fill any of those buckets as a law student. I was actually, I think, quite intimidated by the law school environment as a woman of color. I didn't feel, I think, particularly at home in many spaces. And the idea of law review was just like, that's not how I want to spend my time. I want to spend my time with clients. Not that there's not skills you can develop, to be clear, but it just was, none of that looked like me and the pathway that I wanted to create as a future lawyer. So, but those are often things that most people tend to associate with the law professor track, right? Which I was not on. What I did really like in law school were 2 things. Clinics and externships. I did every single one as soon as I was eligible, as much as possible, because that was certainly grounded me with community work. It reminded me of my motivation, et cetera. And I was very involved in the law school community in terms of sort of student leadership and all those sorts of things, which is like how I survived and ended up, I think, enjoying my experience. So when I left law school, I fulfilled the initial goal of becoming a racial justice lawyer at a nonprofit in DC. But I sort of, when I had left, I was like, what is it about law school that I liked so much? And it wasn't actually sitting in those doctrinal classes for me, even though of course I learned something from them. It was the client work and it was the community spirit that I had sort of created when I felt it wasn't going to be there when I initially joined the law school. So I talked to a mentor who was at my wedding. I mean, some mentors stay connected to you for life, the incomparable Alexa Shabakoff, who used to be at Harvard Law School and is now in a different space. But I said, you know, I feel like I might be able to add value in creating this community, right? And in particularly this community around public service, social justice, diversity, because those were the things that guided me as a student. And she said, you know what, I think you could be really good at this stuff, but you've got to practice law, right? You've got to, if you don't want to be a podium prof, which you definitely don't want to be, you've got to think about what is your right fit and go lawyer and see what you like. And that was the best advice I could have ever received. And I think I would have been very unfulfilled if I had not become a lawyer, because it would not have reminded me of why I came to law school in the first place, right? So I practiced for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. I feel like I should know that offhand, I don't. And ultimately, I probably would have kept practicing, but two things happened. One, I had a baby, and my job required extensive travel, and that was a little challenging for the sort of family I wanted to raise. And then two, I started to see these jobs that were kind of hybrid jobs. The space I occupy, or at least initially occupied at Denver Law, was an externship faculty member. So it's kind of a little bit like how Sarah had mentioned, but it was also a role that involved some administrative work, because I was also, the position was also the director of public interests. And I was like, this might be perfect, right? Like working closely with students, but having a public service role. And when my husband and when I sort of said to my husband, I think it's time for me to start looking, right? I think I've gotten some practice experience, et cetera. His list of places where he would be open to going, because I think, as most people know on this call, you have to be open, right? Because you just never know what's going to happen. His list included places like Moab, Utah, Montana. My list was like New York and Philly and DC. You know, we just had very different views of where we would want to live. So I quickly informed him, as a woman of color who was a racial justice lawyer, I would not be in Montana. That just didn't seem to work for me. And Denver was a great fit. It's a real mix, right, of sort of that outdoorsy stuff and cultural city to offer. So it's been a great fit for us. And I have my job has evolved over time, so we can talk about that another point. But I think what is really great is that I joined a position where I have an ability to develop really close relationships with students, which I think clinical educators get to do differently than other professors. And that allows me to have that community piece that was so important to my experience as a law student.
That's terrific. Thank you all for sharing. And I feel like the common themes that I heard were that no one really quite planned for clinical education, and it's not something you can necessarily plan for in law school to begin with. That you need some years of practice under your belt and then make that move. So Erica, let me ask you this, you know, understanding that, and once you are kind of starting your career path, if you ultimately think you're interested in clinical education down the road, are there key steps that you need to take in your career when you're practicing? Are there certain like musts or should do's that people should keep in mind while they're kind of embarking on their legal practice with an eye toward moving into clinical education later on?
That's an interesting question. I don't think, as you can probably tell from the discussions the three of us have had, I mean, the paths the three of us have taken, there isn't, unlike the doctrinal positions, where there's a much kind of clearer path, the path to clinical positions is a little bit more flexible, I think. The things that I think are important are a really deep knowledge base in some area of law that students might want to learn, and that lends itself to the clinical education model, which is students learning by doing. And so there can be so many different subject matters and also different kinds of practice. So certainly litigation lends itself well to this, but working with nonprofits also does, you know, and helping them get up and running and in compliance with all of the laws that they need to be in compliance with. And then there are all different kinds of models. And so there there are health justice alliances, for instance, medical legal partnerships, where the students are working with med students as well. So there's just a whole range of models. I think the most important thing is to have a knowledge base in a particular area and the flexibility to use those skills in slightly different subject matter areas, because the law schools often will be looking for somebody to run a particular clinic. And so, you know, if you are a person with a lot of administrative law experience, for instance, you may be a good fit for an environmental litigation clinic, and having the flexibility to say, okay, I've done administrative litigation and I'm really interested in doing environmental work, I think can be a really nice path. The one other thing I would say that is really helpful, I think, is if you are interested in doing a fellowship, a lot of clinical programs hire fellows to work with the clinical professors, and having that experience of helping students learn the skills while also representing clients is really helpful, I think.
That's really useful to know. Sarah, we heard Erica talk a bit about the kind of need to balance both having a knowledge base in a particular area, but then also the flexibility to adapt to the clinical openings that a school might have. And it made me think that that sounds a lot different than how one would approach trying to become a doctrinal professor. So can you tell us a bit about the key differences between clinical and doctrinal professorships? How are expectations or qualifications for a clinical role different from a doctrinal role?
So one key difference that I experienced is that years of practice are valued. And, you know, so for a doctrinal position, typically, if you're more than 3 or 4 years out, then the law school starts becoming skeptical about whether you are going to produce scholarship unless you've been producing it, you know, that whole time. And that's why I said, you know, when I was looking at 8 or 9 years out, I started to feel like my, you know, years of practice were not going to be valued on a doctrinal side. So the more years of practice you have, to at least, unless it looks like you're just trying to retire and become a clinical law professor, there is that kind of, you know, if you've practiced for 30 years and you think you're going to retire and work part-time and be a clinical law professor, there might be a little bit of skepticism about that. But otherwise, if you've practiced, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, that's all great. So that's one thing that I think is a significant difference between doctrinal and clinical professors. Another is that clinical professors are expected to know, or at least learn, pedagogical techniques of how to teach students to learn from practice. And that's both on the externship side and also on the clinic side. And that's just something that, although, you know, it's a bonus for a doctrinal professor to be thinking deeply about pedagogical techniques, that's sort of the bread and butter of clinical, like clinical conferences are almost entirely about pedagogy. And so that's one thing that I would suggest, that if you think you're interested in clinical education, then educate yourself and expose yourself to clinical pedagogy. There's a Clinical Legal Education Association is associated with the Clinical Law Review, and you can read lots of articles about different methods of clinical teaching. So that's the other significant difference, is I think there is a great focus on pedagogy.
Great. So it sounds like practice experience and pedagogical knowledge are more valued when it comes to clinical professorships than they would be for doctrinal ones. Alexi, what about things like clerkships or other credentials? Are they helpful for clinical education? Are they as essential as they typically are thought to be for doctrinal positions?
Yeah, I mean, I just outed myself as having never done a judicial clerkship, right? So, I think there is a mix. I also think it's important to note that clinical educators, both in-house clinic and externship, some are tenured, some are not, right? There's still a range. I think in-house clinic is moving more towards more folks being tenured, whereas externship is not yet there. But there are still schools across the country where clinical faculty are not tenured. And why I think that matters, I mean, a couple of things. One way it matters is what your responsibilities are, right? Because tenured folks are typically responsible for scholarship. Untenured folks are typically not. With that said, I'll never forget I think it was my last interview discussion with the dean at the time. And I remember it quite acutely because he was in Japan. So it was like at 10 p.m. at night. And I was like laying in the bed and it was a call from the dean. But what he noticed on my resume, I had not produced any law review scholarship at this time. I had a lot of advising and mentoring with students. I had adjunct taught, et cetera. I think that stuff was very valuable, and obviously practical experience. But I had a bunch of advocacy reports because I was at a nonprofit in which we wrote policy-based reports. And he said to me, well, you like to write. And it was definitely something that I think he saw as an asset. And my response was, well, I like to write if there's a purpose, right? Like if these reports have legs, right? They help the communities I'm serving, so they were valuable. But it was definitely something that I think helped me stand out, at least among some folks who find that to be sort of the pinnacle of what one can be and should be doing in legal education. With that said, for my day-to-day job, scholarship is not required. I often engage in it because sometimes I have something to say, and I think there's not something being said on the topic. But two, I also think there's strategy, right? When I went to the law school, I was an externship faculty member. So it was very different than what Erica described, in that I didn't necessarily have to have expertise in nonprofit formation or appellate litigation. It was like, I have expertise in experiential learning and in public service. So I was going to handle that component, right, of externships. But I now teach a movement lawyering lab because that was my expertise, right? While I think my externship work has been good, I also have no doubt that my willingness and ability to contribute to scholarship throughout my career, and I've been supported by law school to do that, help me be able to do those things and teach non-clinical courses too, right? So I think sometimes, depending on your interest, there's a way to market yourself and do different things. But I didn't have a lot of the traditional things on my resume. I had robust practice experience, and I did have concentrated engagement with students, whether it was with my alumni group, whether it was like adjunct teaching, supervising interns. And I think all of those things, particularly for like clinical work, is relevant because the relationships you develop and sort of the day-to-day is very different than podium prof.
Erica, you spoke a bit earlier about clinical work being the most rewarding job that you've had or that you could imagine. I was wondering if you could tell us whether there are specific skills or interests or qualities that would make someone a good fit for clinical teaching, or that would make it a particularly rewarding job for them.
Yeah, so one thing that I would say, so I teach in a more traditional clinic, which has 16 students, and we get appointed in courts or appointed by courts to represent clients. Two really important, I guess, personality traits, maybe. One is that you have to love working with students. But second, you have to understand that your students will turn over every single year, or every single semester, kind of depending on the clinic. And so I always joke around to my friends that I basically run a small public interest firm with a new class of associates every year that completely turns over. And so they learn, and they're so good by the end, and then they all graduate, and then I start again the next fall, and I'm really worried because I think there's no way they can be as good as the last set, and then by the end of the next year they are, right? And so people who don't feel comfortable with that model, it's not a good fit, because at least for me, it's important that our clients get the highest level of representation possible. And so no matter what, there's always stress at the beginning when we're trying to get the students to write briefs for federal court, right? Because most law students don't have experience doing that. And so you've got to be willing to work with students where they are, and to help them and to find joy in helping them find their voices. And, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. And for some students, it takes longer than for other students. And so I guess the one other thing I would say is it requires a lot of patience too, I think, because it's much easier for me to write a brief by myself. It takes like probably 1/10 of the time than it does to supervise a team of students that as they are working through learning to craft the brief. And I think every clinician would tell you that it always takes a lot longer to teach the students how to do it so that they're doing it rather than to write it on your own.
That's so interesting, that kind of turnover problem, or having your strongest students graduate out, reminds me of almost like coaching college sports, where you kind of lose your most experienced players year after year and just having to adapt and keep generating new talent. That's really interesting and a really good point. Sarah, are there other bumps in the road or challenges that are inherent to clinical education that folks should just be prepared for in this career path?
Well, Lexi sort of touched on it, that there are differences. If you're interested in the prestige of being a doctrinal faculty member with tenure, then this may not be a good path for you if that's something that's very important to you. There are a lot of great clinical jobs that don't involve tenure, and then there are a lot of law schools where they do grant tenure. You know, some of that has to do with whether there's a scholarship expectation. At some universities, you just can't get tenure without the traditional form of scholarship. Other schools will grant tenure or grant what's called clinical tenure, based on a sort of different body of work, other than, you know, maybe some more of the advocacy reports that Lexi was mentioning, or briefs or something like that, as opposed to traditional scholarship. And then other clinicians do actually do traditional scholarship and get tenure that way. But there are a lot of law schools where you just can't really get tenure as a clinical professor, and your salary is typically going to be lower. It's not terrible. There are some schools where it is also terrible, but you should find that out. There are plenty of schools that pay reasonably well, but that have a long-term, presumptively renewable contract, which is sort of like tenure light. You know, to me, it feels like nobody's looking to kick me out the door, so I'm not really actually worried about job security. But if it's important to you to have tenure, then that's something that it's gonna be harder to find in the clinical setting. And for me, like I said, you know, it's been fine for me, but I think for some people that's a real obstacle for them.
Great. Alexi, I was going to ask this anyway, and we actually just got a question in the Q&A about it. But adjunct teaching, how does that help get a clinical professorship? And if someone has not done adjunct teaching but has several years of practice experience under their belt, are their odds reduced, or how significant is adjuncting before trying to move into clinical education?
Yeah, you know, I mean, one of the things that I just think is important, just take a step back, is that there is no one, like, if you have these things, you're in, if you don't have this, you're not. I mean, it is a whole picture kind of thing. So I do just want to reiterate that, because I don't want people to check boxes, right? And then just the opportunity not work. I think adjunct teaching can be helpful. I think It depends on what you're teaching. Clinical teaching, as I think Erica described, quite well, right, it's just different, right, in how you engage. So I think, if you're teaching a podium class, I'm not totally confident that that's going to automatically make you, more eligible, right, for clinical teaching. I think it depends on the subject matter, right? I think it depends on the nature of the course and the pedagogy that you were employing, et cetera. I think I have heard a bit for doctrinal folks that it's not necessarily always a good thing. I think it's probably more of a good thing in the clinical world than it is for doctrinal. And actually, I sometimes, we're often looking for adjuncts, and we often go to practitioners in our community. So sometimes it's not that hard to think about. But what I think it's actually valuable for is less about the entry point and more about, do you actually like teaching, right? I think that is a useful thing to figure out. I helped teach, actually, Erica, at Georgetown, of course. Some years ago, our organization created this kind of course that had an internship component, practicum component, I think is what it was technically called. And I was not the teacher on record, but helped, there was it was a team, we're a nonprofit, right? Everyone helps, right? So all four of us were sort of engaging, and then we supervised the students, et cetera. And I think what it actually showed me was a combination of, one, I really want to be around students, right? I really like this. And two, wow, this is making me anxious that these students are responsible for this work, right? To Erica's point. So, for me, that actually was why externships fit really well, right? Because it was kind of squarely in the middle of that. So I think it was instructive in figuring out, is this a good fit? And I think it also gave me a little bit exposure to the legal academy in a different angle. And, legal academy moves slowly. There's some bureaucratic components, right? There's a whole lot of decision makers. There's some power things that go on. As a student, you don't necessarily, I hope you're not necessarily privy to all that. And I think that getting some insight into that, understanding the layers of hierarchy, understanding what you like best. I absolutely love what I do, and I'm a long-term contract faculty member. And it's I could care less. I'm in the exact right position, I think, for me. But I think having some insight of all that, which I started to get just from some ad hoc conversations that were allowed to happen from the adjunct accessibility, was useful, right? It was informative for me to figure out the next best steps.
Erica, it occurs to me that a lot of our conversation has been framed around clinical education and doctrinal education being mutually exclusive career paths, but it does seem like it may be possible to exist in both the doctrinal and the clinical worlds simultaneously. So what should we know about that? Is it possible to do both? Is that something that many folks do?
It is possible to do both. And as I described at the beginning, that was kind of my path, for a lot of the years for the 6-7 years at Georgia that I'd had the clinic, I also taught a very large evidence class and a first-year criminal law class. So a lot of law schools expect their clinicians to also be teaching at least one doctrinal class, and maybe two. And that's simply because they need the coverage for those classes. That having been said, the nice thing, at least for me, about doing both was that I got exposure to a lot more students, because most of the clinical classes are much smaller. And so I really, really liked my big classes, and I got to know the students. I probably got to teach about between a third and a half of the entire law school class at Georgia in my big classes. And then I had my clinic. I also felt like my work in the clinic really helped me develop as a doctrinal teacher, and to bring some of the clinical pedagogical methods that I was learning into the doctrinal classes. And so I felt like I became a better doctrinal teacher. And so, at least for me, I really liked doing both. Right now, I only have my clinic, and it is more than a full-time job. At some point, I think I would love to pick evidence back up, because it's such a fun class to teach, and it's such a kind of a big core one. So if you think you'd like to do both, there are definitely positions out there that are looking for that are looking for both. The other thing is that at most law schools, if you're hired to teach a clinic and you're willing to teach a doctrinal class, they will probably not turn you down because they need people to teach. So I do think it's definitely a viable thing to consider. And it just uses different parts of your brain, which is kind of nice. I also, the last thing I'd say is I love teaching 1Ls, and I really miss teaching 1Ls because it's just fun.
I enjoy teaching 1Ls too. Alexi, let me ask you this. You spoke about the importance of your mentor pushing you toward clinical education earlier. Could you say a little bit more about how mentors can play a role in getting into clinical teaching, and just more broadly, how networking can help get a foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean, I think mentors know you. And I think that was what was really helpful for me too, is that not only was she able to supply, or were they, I should say, been benefited by many mentors, but they're able to supply ideas and make connections, right? Call people, hey, this person's applying. That stuff still happens and it matters. And if you have an ability for people to be your advocates, I think that's great. But mentors also know you, and that they say, you know what, I don't actually think this is a great fit, right? And I think that's important to get reflections from others who've seen you grow, right? And who've seen how you succeed best. I think mentors also help you ask questions. Like, I went into the law school faculty hiring process like completely unaware of like the job talk process, like what all of that was, and going into my imposter syndrome that I think I described a little bit at the beginning in terms of being a law student, it came like flooding back, even though at this point I was like a totally accomplished, racial justice lawyer. And I think frankly, without that mentor, who then also connected me to a few other people who had recently navigated this, I would have even known what to expect, right? And I'm sure I would have, done horribly, right? So I think, getting insight, and I think then negotiating, like, what is the information you've got? I mean, you have to lean on other people who've navigated things so that you can have as much, make decisions and have as much information as possible, right? I think to make those decisions in an informed way. And certainly I do that obviously now with students who are doing jobs, but I will also very much do that with people who are considering various faculty positions, because I hugely benefited from it. And I think those of us who maybe came to these ideas later, or who come from identities in which they're not represented all the time in the legal academy, I mean, even more so, right? We need to talk to folks. So I will happily, put my email in the chat and talk to anyone, as I'm sure my colleagues will too here, who wants advice. But I think, for me, I think it really is really helpful in opening doors, getting insights, and in helping you sort of narrow what is your best fit within the academy.
Great. So we've heard a lot about the importance of informal resources like networking and mentors. Sarah, let me close with this question to you, and then we'll turn to some questions that are coming in through the chat and the Q&A. So everybody feel free to keep submitting those. But Sarah, are there any other resources out there that folks should know about if they're interested in clinical education? Like, what's the best way for people to kind of get their bearings around how to get into this field?
So I would go to the CLEA website, this Clinical Legal Education Association, cleaweb.org. They have job postings there. They have a lot of webinars. They have the New Clinicians Workshop, which is free, at least this year, because it's virtual. And so that's one place to start. And you can also sign up for a listserv. If you do, I think if you search Google for law clinic listserv, then the first thing that comes up is I think it's through Washington University School of Law, and you can sign up for the listserv. And it's just useful to sign up and to watch the email traffic and see what people are talking about, and get that sense of both job postings will come through there, but also to see what it is that clinical faculty do, what they're asking about, what they're talking about. That's where they post questions about, I've got this issue in my clinic. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this student, or how to deal with, COVID policies or whatever. And so you'll get a sense of like, what is it that people are talking about in the clinic world right now. The other resource is for externships. It's actually Lextern Web, Lextern. And there are a lot of great resources there, most of which are specific to externships, but some of which are more useful clinical education. And then American Association of Law Schools, that is mostly behind a login. But if you have a friend who is every law school basically is a member of AALS, American Association of Law Schools. There is a clinical section. They have a conference every year, and so that can also be a resource, but sometimes it's a little bit harder to access, but it's something that maybe if you know somebody who's a clinical professor, then they can sort of pass along resources. So those are the big three. Lexi and Erica might have other suggestions, but those are the main ones that I can think of.
I would add maybe just two more. I would agree that those are the best for clinical teaching. The Society of American Law Teachers, SALT, it tends to be focused around progressive ideas, diversity ideas, critical topics, but it's all-encompassing in terms of clinical, non-clinical, and they run sometimes different workshops that I think are relevant. And then the other one I would say is there's a variety of ex-crit, but lat-crit in particular partners with SALT to do a faculty development workshop, a new faculty development workshop that they do either, I think it might be every other year in October. It's happening this October virtually. So I think that can be helpful. That might be geared a little bit more toward doctrinal, but it's not exclusively that. So that just might be useful for other resources as well.
So let me add one more thing is a lot of schools, in Georgetown actually is one of them, have clinical fellowship programs where that's your opportunity to, it's the equivalent of a visiting assistant professorship for people who are wanting to go into doctrinal teaching. And so if you want to really get that training in the pedagogy and get your feet wet in teaching, you're certain you want to do clinics and you're trying to find your entry point, then applying to be a clinical fellow can be an entry point. And there are schools like Georgetown and some others that have very robust clinical fellowship programs.
Sarah, that was a perfect segue to the Q&A because we have a question in the chat about clinical fellowships. And it's for Erica from a 3L at William and Mary who's interested in clinical teaching and was wondering at what stage in your career do you recommend doing or pursuing clinical fellowships? Is that something you should do with a certain amount of experience first, or are they something that you should pursue earlier in your career?
So at least at Georgetown, it kind of depends on the clinic, but the clinics where a lot of the fellows want to go out onto the clinical teaching market, in general, they tend to hire people with at least some experience. Because I think you're more competitive on the clinical teaching market if you've got some experience before you become a fellow. And then the fellows are, they teach both the seminars, the clinical seminars, and they also supervise teams of students. And we try to, it's a 2-year fellowship, and we also try to make sure and provide support for writing scholarship over that first summer, so that when the person goes on the market in the fall of their second year, they've got a draft article, they've got that a lot of people on the faculty have given them feedback on, and they've got practice experience. And then they also have clinical teaching, and they've taken a clinical pedagogy seminar during the first year of the fellowship. So I do think those kinds of fellowships are incredibly helpful, not just in terms of, having it on your resume, but also if you're going to be doing a clinical job talk, being able to have the vocabulary to talk about clinical pedagogy, I think, is incredibly helpful. And it's hard to know that unless you've had some training in it.
Great. Alexi, we've got a question in the Q&A from an employment lawyer who would like to know whether there are certain kinds of subject matter expertise that are more or less transferable to a clinical context. And relatedly, what kinds of cases are more or less capable of being run within a clinic? And that question is both specific to employment law and just more generally. So do you have any insight you can offer there?
I mean, I actually think, to be honest, that Erica is probably the best person to answer this question as the resident in-house clinical expert. I know Sarah does this work now too, but I would say that I do think that, at DU, we have some clinics where there's quick turnaround, right? So like housing court or criminal defense court, which I think is helpful for students, not criminal defense court, excuse me, criminal defense clinic, right? Helpful for students to be able to see something from start to finish. In a semester length program. I don't know how employment law works in that context, but then we also have these year-long clinics, right, where people are doing like federal civil rights litigation. So I think there are, I don't think there's one set area of law. I mean, if you were to look up in-house clinics across the country, there's so many different areas. I think that employment law, we maybe see this the most in like a workers' rights context, sometimes with like wage issues. Sometimes there's a relationship there with immigration and workers' rights, et cetera. So, but Erica, I don't know if you want to add to that. You might have some best insight.
Yeah, I completely agree with Alexi's response there. The one thing I would say is that a lot, in general, clinics do work in the public interest. And so to the extent that there is an area of law that can serve the public interest, I think most clinics really prioritize that. And so employment is a good example of that, right? So there are some schools that, for instance, have civil law clinics or civil rights clinics that, employment discrimination cases would be a really good way of doing that type of litigation. And so I guess the short answer to the question is no, there isn't really, except that it's got to be an area that in some way furthers the public interest.
I'll just add that, if you can find it, if it's an area where there are people who can't afford legal services, and that's, in the public interest, that's what we mean, because if they could hire a law firm, they probably will hire a law firm as opposed to working with students. So, that's the reality of the kind of work that we do, is that we're typically going to be providing services to people who either completely can't afford them or it's difficult for them to afford those services. In terms of the type of case, there's a whole pedagogy over large case versus small case. And there are things that, it can be complex to try and figure out how to slice and dice up a case so that students can take responsibility for a part. And there's a whole sort of philosophy about, giving students as much responsibility as possible, which is easier to do in the small case clinic where they can actually represent a client completely on their own. But that's not to say that there aren't clinics and, some appeals clinics, but also we have environmental law clinics, cases that last a long time where that's just not possible. And that's not a reason why we wouldn't allow students to do that. You just have to, it's a lot more complicated to figure out how you can really make this a good experience for the student. You are not just supervising students like you would in a, partners, supervising associates in a law firm. You are actually trying to give them as much responsibility as possible so they can learn what it is like to be a lawyer and to be responsible for a client. And so it is a different sort of way of thinking about what it is that you can do, what kinds of cases that you can do with students.
Sarah, we have a follow-up question in the Q&A about geographic flexibility or lack thereof. And that's something that we've touched on a few times today. Alexi talked about negotiating with her husband about cities versus the mountains. But let's say you don't have much, if any, flexibility and being able to pick up and move, and you're restricted to targeting just one large law school in the context of the question here. is that a fool's errand, or is it worth a try? And do you have any tips for making that work?
Yeah, so that was sort of the position I was in. I was looking at a few schools mostly in the Atlanta area, but then willing to maybe commute, an hour or two. In that case, I think you have to network a lot. So because particularly in the clinical setting, a law school may be willing to create a clinic if they're persuaded that you would do a good job with it. It depends on the law school. But there may be opportunities to create positions that don't already exist. And so if you're already working with them, if you can do adjunct work with them, just talk to people both on the doctrinal side and on the clinical side, just to find out sort of whether someone's thinking about hiring somebody. They're typically going to have to post most positions, but it's sort of nice to know that it's coming so that you can prepare your resume and build relationships with people. So that's the best advice I can give, is just to sort of be patient is one thing. There just might not be that position available right when you're looking. Be willing to commute a little bit. But also just have conversations, keep having coffee with people, and keep having conversations with people like us, the directors of clinical programs, because, and I'm in conversations like that all the time, where somebody would really like to, be involved in clinical teaching at a particular law school, and they're just trying to find the opportunity. And we are certainly willing to work with them to see if we can find an opportunity for them.
And if I could just add very quickly, Joel, I completely agree with that. And the way hiring gets done is sometimes a little bit haphazard. It's a little different than the doctrinal classes where, they've got to get the people to teach the first year curriculum and then the big upper level classes. So the more you can be knocking on people's doors and speaking enthusiastically about how you want to teach, I think the better. And like Sarah, I get a lot of these emails from people who are interested in teaching. Once I've had a conversation with somebody, then I feel invested in them. So the more you can reach out, I think the better.
Great. I think we have time for one last question before we wrap up. Erica, I'll stay with you here. The question is whether you have any suggestions for someone who's practiced for over 30 years in a single area of law and wants to do clinical teaching on a part-time basis. Any tips or suggestions there?
Yeah, so basically the same type of suggestion that we just gave to the last question, which is to have some flexibility in the way that you teach, or in the way the teaching happens, because it may be that you could do some externships, or it may be that they're looking for a part-time person to do a small clinic, but there's no way you're going to know that unless you reach out to law schools. If you're geographically flexible, I often think it's better to approach law schools that are bigger because they sometimes have a little bit more flexibility. But just reach out to some people at a couple of law schools and ask them if they've heard anything about people needing somebody to do this kind of work. The one really nice thing about the clinical teaching community is it is very, very close and protective of each other and protective of the people who go on the market in many ways. So it does feel different from the doctrinal market, I think. So just reach out to people and see if folks have suggestions.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you all so much. I think this has been a really helpful and constructive conversation to shed some light on a path that is maybe kind of opaque and unclear to people, depending on where they are in their careers. So thank you very much for today's conversation. And for those of you who missed part 1 of this series on paths to legal academia. Be sure to check out the video recording of that, which is on the ACS website, and Kara actually put a link to it in the chat. So be sure to take a look at that. And keep in mind, this is an ongoing series, and we encourage you to let ACS know what topics within this larger subject of getting into legal academia would be helpful or useful, and what additional programming and information you'd like us to provide. So feel free to send any suggestions you have to Kara or anyone else at the ACS Network Advancement team that you're in contact with. And last but not least, be sure to save the date for ACS's virtual convention, which will be held June 7th to 11th, again, entirely virtually online. Information will be available on the ACS website shortly. So again, thank you all very much for joining us. I hope this has been helpful, and have a great rest of your day.